gatherings. The term tertulia was used starting in the 19th century for groups of people who met informally on a regular basis to chat about current affairs, literature, and the arts, a little bit like a salon. We hope to continue these conversations on the first Tuesday of each month, and we hope that you will join us. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with the Hispanic Society's Senior Curator of Paintings, Drawings, and Metalwork, Marcus Burke. Marcus will discuss a fascinating painting. It's called El Costeño by Mexican artist José Agustín. The painting was acquired by the museum relatively recently in 2013. Now, the format is going to be like this. After Marcus's discussion, we will have a conversation about the work, he and I, and we invite all of you to join us afterward by submitting your questions in the comments section. As this is our first time launching the program, please excuse any little or big technical issues as we all adjust to this new virtual world. So thank you. And here is Dr. Marcus Burke.
Thank you so much, Philippe. And happy Cinco de Mayo to everyone. I have my margarita here.
And my daiquiri.
It seems essential equipment today. I'm going to take just a moment to share my screen with you and to launch the slides for my discussion. The picture El Costeño, the young man from the coast, was painted by the Mexican 19th century artist, José Agustín Arrieta, who was active at Puebla, Mexico, Mexico's second largest city in the 19th century, from the mid-1820s until 1874. He painted genre, images of everyday life, little comedies and melodramas, some of them also studies of ethnic types, and absolutely marvelous still lives. He painted El Costeño at some point after 1843, and the picture is life-sized and shows the young man at 3/4 length. It is a young Afro-Mexican man holding a basket of fruit, and the name El Costeño means a man from the coast, probably the coast of the Gulf of Mexico. In colonial times in 19th century, there were 3 clusters of self-identifying Afro-Mexican communities in Mexico. One along the coast of Veracruz, which you see on the map at upper right. It's to the east of Puebla. One in Oaxaca in the far south of Mexico, which is at the bottom of the map, and at Guerrero in the southwest. Here, let me see if I can show you these. Veracruz, Oaxaca, and Guerrero. Here is Puebla. You can also see that Puebla is very well connected to the coast of Veracruz. And so that's the probable origin of the family of the young man. Incidentally, the Veracruz Afro-Mexican community has blended into the local mestizaje or racial mixtures of the area, but the other 2 groups are still thriving and have sent immigrants to, of all places, North Carolina, where they are a buffer group between Hispanic and African American. We have no information on the young man. We don't know his name, but we can assume he was either a fruit merchant or someone working for a fruit merchant or a domestic worker bringing fruit to the table. By the way, the wonderful still life of fruit shows typical produce of the east central and coastal region of Mexico. The red fruit exploding in the lower left of the composition is a mamey. In taste, a bit like a cross of a papaya and a strawberry. Behind the mamey is probably a yellow mango. And along the back edge of the basket, back here, next to his shirt, are avocados, aguacates criollos in Spanish. Then there's a prominent melon, a pineapple, then the purple spotted fruit in the middle, which is either a prickly cactus pear or perhaps a passion fruit. And then there are the smaller round red fruits, which are either tamarillos, a bit like a red passion fruit, or red palm fruits. The young man may be a domestic worker is suggested by a similar painting by Arrieta, an image of a young woman dressed in the white blouse and red patterned skirt of a local Pueblan folk costume called a china poblana, but lacking the scarf that's usually crossed over her chest. The picture of the young woman is signed and documented to around 1843. This is apparently when Arrieta began painting single ethnic figures against a plain background. El Costeño would be after that date. The young woman is bringing a mouth-watering tray of roast turkey to the table. It probably tasted similar to the famous turkey mole poblano of today. The turkey is decorated with onion rings and seems more ready to eat than the fruits in El Costeño, which have more of the set piece of a still life. This is not surprising, since Arrieta was one of the most important still life painters of 19th century Mexico, as this work from the National Museum of Art attests. Philippe de Montebello and I have been discussing the artistic contrast between these two paintings, and we'll get back to that again when we have our discussion. But it really does not seem possible that they were ever a pair. One reason might be that El Costeño was painted later than the young woman with a turkey. The period in the later 1840s and early 1850s saw Arrieta working at the top of his game. In spite of the social and economic chaos that, of what we call the Mexican War, and the Mexicans call the United States intervention, which occurred between 1846 and 1848. He produced insightful, haunting images. There's a hint of mystery about their full meaning. The woman at the left is dressed as a china poblana with her scarf crossed across her chest. And the man is a chinaco, a member of a rural guerrilla warrior group or partisans who fought against the US soldiers. This dates the picture to the late 1840s. In the 1860s, these groups helped defeat the French in the Battle of Puebla on the 5th of May, 1862. Cinco de Mayo. Something mysterious is going on in the picture. In Mexican 19th century ethnic prints, the pairing of a china and a chinaco was a bit like that of the majas and majos in Goya's paintings. That the man is dominating the woman is underscored by the captive bird that he holds in his hand, gently, whispering to it almost tenderly, and of course, his hand on her shoulder. She is, by the way, holding a piece of sugar cane. Notice, however, the painting of the shirt sleeve, a more dramatic version of El Costeño's wonderful white shirt. The two pictures are probably closer in date to each other than either of them is to the woman with a turkey. One extraordinary thing about El Costeño is the absolute absence of any racial or ethnic stereotyping. The young man is simply but cleanly dressed, presented silhouetted, and that's important, silhouetted against the background, soberly presenting his wares as he gazes straight into the eyes of the viewer. His eyebrows are slightly raised and his lips are pulled back, making creases in his cheeks near the mouth. Nothing in the picture can be taken as racist. Any such idea is brought to the picture, now as in the 19th century, by the viewer. In fact, the respectful, even celebratory presentation of different races and ethnic types in Mexican art goes back 150 years before Arrieta's pictures, in portraits of Mexicans of various races and the so-called castas paintings of the Mexican tradition. They are images of racial mixtures. Already at the end of the 1600s, Mexican artists were depicting people of non-European racial heritage in a descriptive, respectful way, as the image on the right from 1711 of a rather elegantly dressed young African-American woman, a mulata in contemporary usage. The artist, Manuel Arriano, also did a portrait of a noble indigenous woman. Remember that leaders of the indigenous nations were accepted into the Spanish nobility. The Hispanic Society has this magnificent casta image by Juan Rodriguez Juarez of around 1720 on the left. It shows a tobacco merchant of mixed European and indigenous Mexican descent who has married an indigenous Mexican woman. She's dressed like a princess in a beautiful silk huipil and headdress. Their child holds a bowl of petite white pears, just as El Costeño displays the fruits of Mexican horticulture. I want to show you a work by William Sidney Mount, an American painter, called Right and Left. It was painted in 1850, contemporary with El Costeño, and it depicts an African-American musician. Mount was active on Long Island and was himself a musician, and he shows his sitter respectfully, even admiringly, with no hint of ethnic stereotyping, just as Arrieta did. The painting's title, Right and Left, suggests that the man was ambidextrous as a violin virtuoso. Notice, by the way, and I move the cursor here, the wavy blue line decorating the shirt. There's a very similar motif on El Costeño's overalls. Finally, a word about the acquisition of the picture, certainly one of Arrieta's finest achievements. By the way, here are the wavy lines, perhaps due to the creases in the pants of the sitter, or the standard. Archer Milton Huntington, who you see at upper left, the founder of the Hispanic Society, did not as a rule buy works of art in the countries of origin without specific permission from the authorities. For someone who is the child of a so-called robber baron, this is truly extraordinary. Today, we follow our founder's lead and are as careful as possible not to acquire works of art illegally. When this picture was acquired about 7 years ago, our agent in Mexico, who at the time worked for a large international auction house, spent over a year negotiating the complicated purchase of the picture and obtaining the proper export permission from the Mexican authorities. We are very grateful to the Mexican government that they made possible the sharing of this great work of art with the American public, and now through our International Traveling Treasures exhibition with viewers internationally, including in Mexico itself. Happy Cinco de Mayo.
Thank you, Marcus, for this wonderful presentation. I have a couple of questions for you before we turn the tertulia over to our friends. And I'm thrilled that, by the way, more than 100 of you have logged on. I think that's wonderful. But let me also first say how appropriate it is that we should be speaking about a picture from a painter from Puebla. As you've noted, this is the Cinco de Mayo, a major holiday that celebrates Mexico's victory at the Battle of Puebla in 1862. Now, my first question is, noting that the acquisition is recent, and that quite a number of works from Latin America have been purchased in recent years. Has there been a shift in acquisitions policy at the Hispanic Society?
Philippe, there certainly has. It's been an active, assertive effort on our part to legally acquire works of art of Latin American origin. I would say that El Costeño was one of the high points of this campaign, but even in the last 2 years, we've had some remarkable works of Mexican and Peruvian colonial art come into the collection, and many, many wonderful works of silver, lacquer, and so forth in the decorative arts. In our treasures exhibition, there are just knee-weakening examples of these works, some of them acquired by our founder, but most of them recent acquisitions.
I was very interested in your mentioning and noting in the Costeño the lack of any form of stereotyping, not at all racist. This is something we would bring into the picture. Of course, I think you're right, it's depicted very sympathetically, but we are living in a time when the question arises, would not, and especially it concerns the casta painting, would not a Spaniard have, in a sense, wanted to express his dominance as a purebred white person by the depiction of people of various races?
There is an assumption that that was the case. The two series by Juan Rodriguez Juarez, of which we have one picture, were sent back to Spain, one to the king, the new Bourbon king of Spain, to show who his subjects were. However, there's no question in the casta system, which was a popular set of 12 or 16 racial mixture names, the top of the heap was criollos, people of European descent, who were called Español, usually Spanish. And then the mixtures filtered down from there. However, the question is not so much what the system, which was indubitably racist, demanded, but what the artists did with them. I'm going to take the screen over again for a minute and show you here. Just a minute, I got to click here and then go up. Show you again these paintings. I'm going to go one more, which in this case, we have a mestizo, a Euro indigenous mixture, marrying a full-blooded indigenous Mexican, rather elegantly dressed. Their son's called a coyote, which is just a name that was applied to this particular mixture, which didn't have a bad, by the way, connotation in Mexico. But look at them. They too are silhouetted, moving in a stately manner to the left. The artist refused to embrace that part of the system and instead celebrated these people. There's an even better series in the mid-18th century by Cabrera, who was himself from Oaxaca and of partial indigenous origin. And he does all sorts of wonderful things like having when a Spaniard is marrying an indigenous woman, having the Spaniard's face turned away, things like that. The better artists were not seduced. In the case of Arellano here, he's doing a straightforward portrait, and the woman is quite wealthy. She's got a choker of pearls, huge pearl drop earrings, and this gorgeous, very interesting ethnic costume, which is it's Mexican, but not in any way indigenous or anything like that. It depends on the artists. There are always those who will play the cheap shot. Let me get you back here. There you go.
No, I mean, that's very interesting that it would be a kind of a strictly declarative, documentary picture. Let me get back to the issue that you raised when you showed the portrait of the young woman with her own, bearing her own tray and how much more naive in a way was the treatment of the dress and even her face. Whereas here you have a very accomplished painting of a young man, beautifully executed drapery. And I was wondering, thinking in terms of the practices of the 17th and 18th century, when very frequently in ateliers you had more than one hand at work. Jan Bruegel, the younger, for example, would paint the flowers in pictures by Rubens. Is it not possible that we could be dealing here with two hands?
I'm going to share the screen again and go back to that comparison. I don't think there's two hands in El Costeño, the brushworks uniform. Of course, that would be in an atelier too. The figure's magnificent, still life's magnificent. We know that Arrieta could do still lives, not only do them, but magnificent ones. I think the problem here is less a problem of several hands within a painting, but there certainly is a wide discrepancy between the artistic achievement of various paintings given to Arrieta, including those he signed. He signed the one on the left. He wasn't self-educated. He had a sort of an academic education, but I do note that he went back to be a teacher of things like how to paint still lives at the Puebla Academy, and he may have learned on the job there. He may have just simply gotten better as he went through the 1640s and hit his stride. I find particularly compelling this comparison, which are two very strong works of art. The one on the left, a little contrived perhaps. Maybe if we knew a little bit more about what it meant, it wouldn't seem so. But they it seems to me, are of the same ilk, of the same category, as the Spanish would say. There are other works by Arrieta where you just roll your eyes. Not that they're bad, but that they're trying to do something. They're kind of a little bit in your face with their folkishness. And in fact, we know that he was very fervently using his works of art to make a patriotic statement about the people of Puebla and the people of Mexico. I don't see that kind of adherent value here on these pictures. They just speak for themselves, except that we see the serape and we see the slit bell-bottom trousers of the man, and know that the Chinacos used this, and that's where the title came from, and which suggests to me anyway the potential date for the picture. But there is no question that in the entire number of works, it's uneven.
Marcus, one other question before I turn it over to our friends. And this is about the still life itself, which is highly accomplished. And you showed an individual still life of Bodegón earlier. And there is, of course, the still life in the other picture. They show a kind of a separateness of the objects, of the fruit mostly, very reminiscent of the kinds of still life that we're accustomed to seeing in painting from Seville, such as Zurbarán and so forth. What is the training? What was the training, and where and how was he trained, and by whom?
He was trained in Puebla. At the time of independence in the 1820s, where he was coming of age, as it were, Puebla was still functioning as a social and economic and political center. Mexico City was in a lot of disarray at that point. The Mexico Academy, as I am informed by other scholars, was in a moment of great crisis, since the royal patronage that had sustained it, of course, went out the window, right? The Puebla Academy was locally mostly church related, oddly enough. And there were, all through the 19th century, prelates at the cathedral helping it keep going. However, it's clear his education was spotty by 19th century standards, that he had a lot of trouble with anatomy, for example, figure drawing. He never learned to draw a horse. I think in terms of still life, he really had quickly become quite a master. And I think in El Costeño, he just couldn't resist making a wonderful still life at the expense of telling a story. Do you understand? All the fruits are not peeled except the mamey, but boy, does that have a good compositional effect. And that's what a still life master does. I also noticed, by the way, that you can see an arc of improvement in his still lives. And by the time he gets to his mature moment in that genre, there's very few people that can beat him. You think of Rembrandt and Raphael Peale and Pito and those artists and the other great still lives of the United States in the 19th century. There seems to be a zeitgeist going on here. With regard to Velázquez and all that, there were works by Zurbarán Velázquez, or at least after Velázquez, in Mexico. There were many still lives from the European school. So that was available to him both in Puebla, even in the cathedral, and also in Mexico City.
Well, thank you for that. This is a tertulia. We are many people, others are not being seen on the screen. And I think it's time to open this session to questions from our patrons, our members, our friends. And
wonderful. Thank you so much, Philippe and Marcus. We do have, yes, we have one question from one of our members in Pennsylvania. He'd like to ask, could you speak a little bit about the context of El Costeño's creation? Was it commissioned? Who would have seen it in the 19th century, and to what effect?
That's a good question. I'll let Marcus answer it.
Well, we know that that Arrieta had upper middle class patrons, including the German community, which was in Puebla, which were international tradesmen and proto-industrialists and so forth. He had one patron who took all kinds of pictures back to Dusseldorf, I think it was, a German family with a cute little poodle, by the way. We have portraits. We also have Arrieta showing them out in Puebla with the genre, with the folk types. So there's a upper middle class, alta burguesa patronage that's going on here. We know that although we see very few religious paintings and no portraits of prelates, we know that they were his patrons because they were also patrons of the academy and gave him his job, and he ended up living in an apartment in the cathedral at the end of his life. There was relatively little government patronage for him. I don't think there was very much for anybody outside of Mexico City. I think he was painting for the market. We have no clue who commissioned El Costeño or why it was done. A lot of these things were probably done on spec and then offered to his circle of patrons. This is exactly how El Greco worked, or Rubens went outside of his commissions, and many artists in the 19th and 20th century, especially the late 19th century. Goya did a bit of this. I think in Puebla, though, it was the middle class that was the market.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marcus. And we have a question from Robert Simon, which is very much related, and it's about the audience. If the audience of Arrieta's work was primarily Mexican or Spanish, and where and how the paintings would have been sold. So I think you just addressed this, but if you could maybe elaborate a little bit more if we know anything specifically about Arrieta's case.
Well, I think we're too late in Mexican culture for there to be an exclusive Criollo audience. Of course, I just spoke about an immigrant to Mexico, a businessman immigrant, and his equally German wife. But I think we're in a moment now where Benito Juarez, who was an indigenous Oaxacan, he was president. We have a, or would be soon, be president. we're in a moment when there was a great deal of cultural and racial change in Mexican society, where the old dominant class inherited from colonial times, who were mostly of European descent, were mixing now with others in both political and economic control, especially economic. That's very important. Puebla is a city that was founded by the Spaniards, so it never had that essential indigenous base that other places had, nothing like Oaxaca, for example. But we see in Arrieta somebody who had political reasons for wanting to show the whole society. I think the audience was quite varied and probably went beyond the upper middle class patrons. I think when he exhibited these works publicly, and there were exhibitions, a lot of people of all races and classes came to see them. They certainly speak to that group, but we know from the 17th century, for example, that the people who collected genre paintings were often the highest level of society. The Duke of Alcala in Italy, for example, was a patron of the Bomboccianti, the genre pictures, mostly Dutchmen working in Italy. So it's a complicated patronage issue, but I think in terms of the images themselves, they're aimed at a wider audience. And by the way, hi, Bob. Nice to hear from you.
Marcus, I think part of the question, if I'm not mistaken, Mr. Simon, was there an art market, and would they have been exported at the time? Was there a market outside of Mexico for his pictures in the 19th century?
Well, there certainly was among the Germans who were known to these people who were at Puebla. A lot of pictures went off to Germany.
But locally?
Huh? Well, no, first it was a local immigrant German, and then people back there got a taste. But all of these, and this also includes the so-called traveler artists like Nebo and so forth, who went around Latin America. All of these were being sent off as a kind of a ethnic thing. I remember one time I grew up in Louisville, Kentucky. My sister and I were going with a bunch of friends down to Nashville to the Grand Ole Opry. And my sister looked at me and said, "That's an ethnic thing," you know? And there's a little bit about that. You wanted to see the 19th century was very into ethnology. This is the exact moment when Mérimée is writing Carmen. This is the exact moment when Spain is becoming an ethnic obsession with the rest of Europe. Africa begins at the Pyrenees and all that. This is when the empires of Europe were stretching also into the nearby Middle East. And you get the Oriental images. So
Marcus,
it's a part of a bigger phenomenon.
Marcus, are you suggesting that there's an intimation of Orientalism in that picture?
No, not at all. I'm doing an analogy here.
All right.
It's similar to Fortuny in Morocco or Jérôme in Egypt and so forth. It's a similar thing, but in this case, there is no colony anymore. It's simply showing the ethnographic reality of the moment, but romanticizing it. These are not straight shots. Whenever you have a China and Chinaco, that's a type, and that's in lithographs from the 1830s on. And actually, by this point, women didn't much dress this way, except on fiestas and what have you. It was kind of dépassé, but it was used as the way that Watteau used the commedia dell'arte as a metaphor. He was using the ethnic world, the costumbrismo, the people as a metaphor. Exactly what's going on in American art at the same time. George Caleb Bingham, William Sidney Mount, Eastman Johnson. There's a whole string of artists in North America doing exactly the same thing with various subtle nuances of class and race and so forth.
Well, it's difficult also not to see in the figure of the Costeño a parallel to a picture that wasn't painted that much later, which is of course the Olympia of Manet. But that's a big subject. Do we have any other questions from our friends?
Yes, we have a question from Asunción Arnedo, She is wondering, Arrieta's colors are vibrant and seductive. Do you know where Mexican artists at this time would have obtained their pigments?
Oh, haha. Mexico was a pigment exporter. We have a wonderful painting of Saint Michael casting the rebel angels out of heaven. The angel, the knot of demons, was painted with the help of a print by Rubens. That was a very important one. This is a work from the 1640s by an immigrant painter into Mexico who had completely embraced Mexican art. The background is blue ochre. Now, blue ochre is generally only found in certain German and Polish paintings, and it's not a stable painting there, but it was a stable painting in Mexico and a lot cheaper than ultramarine and cerulean and the other things. And to this day, there are mines up in the Sonora Desert in Chihuahua, and there was a mine near Mexico City as well. I'm just giving one example. And this is Maya blue, which is a dye and a blue pigment, and of course, cochineal red pigments and all that. Oh yeah, that's absolutely, they're mercury mines, so there's mercury red. That's an absolute Mexican tradition. And as a matter of fact, Mexican painters were using Prussian blue in the early 1720s, which means that it was within a decade of the publication of the formula from Prussia. That probably came from mining technology. No. That's absolutely typical of the Mexican school.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And we do have another question from Carmen San Miguel. Carmen said, Mexico did not have African slavery. When and how did this African descended community develop in Puebla?
Well, there were these communities of these people from other places in Puebla and Mexico City, but there were Afro-Mexicans in both of them since the 1500s. Now, by the middle of the 18th century, slavery was kind of falling apart in the Spanish Empire. It kind of withered on the vine, thank heavens. So by 1800, there wasn't much left. Slavery was outlawed in Mexico in 1827. Everybody was emancipated at that moment. That would mean that this young man, assuming he was actually from one of these three Afro-Mexican self-identifying communities, was at least third generation in those regions, and probably fifth or sixth or seventh generation Mexican. He was simply a Mexican of African descent. What makes him unusual, he's rather, if you'll excuse the expression, pure-blooded African. He has come from a community where the African community has maintained its integrity racially, and that makes him unusual and makes him stand out a little bit, because even by 1850, the mixing of races was really very far advanced.
Great.
Did I answer the question? I don't know.
Yes. And we have just our last question here, which came in via email. And one of our members is wondering if you can still find the fruits depicted today in Mexico, and if you can find, for example, a fruit like the mamey here in the United States, or if these are, fruits that you just can't find anymore.
Can you find them where you live, Philippe? I don't know.
No, I thought it was a wonderful question.
Yeah. Well, I can tell you, if you come up to 155th and Broadway, all you have to do is walk out on the sidewalk and you'll find most of them. One of the most wonderful things you can drink in a restaurant in Upper Manhattan is a mamey smoothie, a batida de mamey. That's wonderful. You don't see the fresh fruit. It's rather fragile, but there's all the supermarkets and most of the delis have frozen mamey to make your smoothie with. The aguacates criollos, the little dark one, they're around. Passion fruits around. Prickly pears around. Mangoes. I don't know about tamarillos and palm fruits. They're very tropical, and I don't know how well they travel. But I know there's a big market for them in the United States online grocery business. So that's yes. The answer is yes, by all means.
Wonderful, thank you. And I think with that, we'll conclude the questions segment. And Philippe, if you would like to add anything else, or Marcus, feel free to go ahead. Thank you both so much.
Philippe, you have to unmute yourself.
I'm sorry. I was very pleased by the response of all of our members and friends, and by the tone and liveliness of this episode. And I thank you all for joining, and really hope you and your friends will want to join on June 2. As you know, the Tertulia will be on the first Tuesday of every month. So on June 2 at 5 p.m. sharp, we will have our curator of prints and photographs, Patrick Lenigan, who will discuss photographs of Latin America, mostly from the 19th century into the 20th. As you know, the Hispanic Society has an extraordinary collection of over 150,000 photographs that document Latin America, and finally, and Spain as well, and the Philippines and the whole larger Hispanic world. And finally, since today is Giving Tuesday, please consider donating to the Hispanic Society Museum and Library, and then make sure to renew your membership by visiting our website and click under Donate. I look forward to seeing all of you on June 2. Thank you for being with us.
Feliz Cinco de Mayo.
Cinco de Mayo and 2 de Junio.